The unknown Dardanus and the Great Flood of 14,000 years ago. This is around the time of the Younger Dryas, the last ice age area. The unknown Dardanus of ancient Greece, a flood that happened 14,000 years ago. In Greek mythology, Dardanus was the son of Zeus and Electra, of the ancient pantheon of the Olympian gods, daughter of Atlas and the founder of the city of Dardanus on Mount Ida in Troy. Dionysius of Halicarnassos mentions that the homeland of Dardanus was Arcadia, where Dardanus and his older brother Iasus or Iasi ruled as kings after Atlas. Dardanus married Chryse, daughter of the giant Palanta, from whom they had two sons, Idios and Dima. After a great flood, however, the survivors who lived in the mountains that had been turned into islands were divided into two groups. The first remained with the Dima king, while the other left, eventually ending up on the island of Samothrace in the northern Greece area, where Iason was struck by lightning by Zeus when he fell in love with the goddess Demeter in his attempt to meet her. Dardanus and his people found the land poor, and most of them settled in Asia, that is today's Turkey and eastward. Yet another record is quoted by Virgil in the Aeneid that the Aeanians in a dream learns from the ancestral Penates that Dardanus and father Iasius and the Penates themselves came from Asperia, which was later named Italy. Other records do not mention either Arcadia or Asperia, although they do refer to a flood and speak of the departure of Dardanus from Samothrace to Troy. This is from a depiction of a map from Herodotus, the ancient Greek, of the known world at that time. And in this map, he even showed that the Nile flowed from east to west. Very strange, but that's what it showed at that time. Kindly support my Patreon account since YouTube has again demonetized my YouTube channel. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. Now, all the records agree that Dardanus came to Troy from Samothrace, and there he was welcomed by King Teucros, son of the river Scamander, and the nymph Idias, from whom the country was called Tecris, and the inhabitants were called Tikros. Tikros welcomed Dardanus with affection and gave him a wife, his daughter Bathea or Vatea, from whom he had two sons, Elon, according to another legend, Troy, and Erichthonius. Dionysius mentions that Chryse, Dardanus' first wife, died. Dardanus, after the death of his father-in-law, became king and named the country Dardania, built a new city of that same name. Dardanus is considered the rapporteur in his country of the worship of the goddess Athena, of whom he made 2 statues, one of which was Palladium Athena, as well as under the nephew of Corivas, who followed him from Samothrace, the mysteries of Caviron. And from Dardanus, all the descendants of the kings of the region were named Dardanides. The first heir to the kingdom was his son Erichthonus of Dardania. And according to Dionysius of Bodrum of Turkey, Dardanus also had a son named Zakynthos. That's the island of Zakynthos in the area between Greece and Italy, from Vatea, and he became the first inhabitant of the island, which was later named Zakynthos. The ancient castle of the island is named Psophis, a strong city of Arcadia, with the first inhabitants Erymanthus, who is also his ancestor. Dionysius also says that the son of Dardanus, Idaeus, gave his name to the Idaean mountains, which is to Mount Ida, where Idaeus built a temple to the mother of the gods, Kiveli, and founded mysteries and ceremonies which were still observed in Phrygia in his time. According to another myth, Dardanus goes to Troy from Crete, and in variation that Tevkros goes from Crete to Troy, where he succeeded Dardanus in the kingdom of Troy. And according to Dionysius of Bodrum, Dardanus left Arcadia to establish a colony in the northeastern Aegean Sea. When the flood of Dardanus began, the ground flooded, and the mountain on which he took refuge with his family to survive created the island of Samothrace. After the end of the flood, he left Samothrace and went to Asia Minor. Fearing a new flood, he did not build a city, but wandered for the next 50 years. His grandson, Troy, eventually built the city of Troy, which took its name. For this flood, we know that a great flood occurred and covered the plains of Arcadia, and the mountains were not able to feed the inhabitants. So only Demas stayed there and some of the inhabitants. Dardanus and Iasi, with the rest of the Arcadians, crossed into Samothrace and built a temple to the gods. And because Samothrace was not able to feed them, because it was relatively barren, only Iasi was left there with a few others, and Dardanus went with the rest to Asia. Generations agree with this because Dardanus was a generation later than Palantus, and from the genus Dardanus to the generation of Hector of the Trojan War, there are 7 generations. So Dardanus went long before the Trojan War to Asia and is the ancestor of the Trojans, who were also Greeks. The Dardanelles flood occurred around 9000 BC. Now we know that that's also the time around the sinking of Atlantis, 9600 and some odd BC. Now, according to Diodorus Sikeliotis, the flood of Dardanus was the oldest of all. Diodorus conveys a tradition of the inhabitants of Samothrace lived in the 1st century AD, while Dardanus was the mythical king of Arcadia who lived in the years after the flood. Diodorus gives a description of the phenomenon and specifically states that the waters came from the Black Sea, overflowing first the blue stones of the Bosporus, which is around today's Istanbul in Turkey, and the Propondis, and then to the northeastern Aegean. The descriptions of the flood in Samothrace are indeed extremely interesting. Quote, "Now I will tell you the history of the Aegean islands starting from Samothrace. The island was inhabited by natives. They say that in ancient times it was called Saonisos, whose strait was opened in the blue stones, the mythical complexes, and then opened by the Hellespont, because the sea of the Black Sea was first a lake and swelled to such a point that due to the pressure of the current, the waters rushed into the Hellespont and flooded the large part of the Aegean coast, and not a small plain of Samothrace turned into a sea. And why? For this reason, in later years, some fishermen pulled out stone capitals with their nets because even cities were flooded. And those who survived that flood took refuge in the highest parts of the island. But as the sea rose higher and higher, they did wish the gods, they prayed to the gods of the place. When they were saved in remembrance of the event, they erected stone borders around the island and built altars. So it's obvious that Samothrace was inhabited before the flood, Diodorus Sikeliotis, Historical Library 547. The results of modern scientific research from Columbia University in the United States confirms this ancient narrative. Elias Mariolakos, professor of geology, University of Athens, showed that this flood may have occurred only in the period from 12,500 to 14,500 years ago. So that's the age of the younger Dryas comet asteroid impact. They prevailed then, and how they changed. 18,000 years ago, there were glaciers in the northern hemisphere up to the Alps and northern Greece. That was all a glacier covered, and below that, south of that, was clear of glaciers. So that's the borderline. England and North Europe was under glaciers, of course. Now, 18,000 years ago, where there were great glaciers in the northern hemisphere of the Earth and the sea level was much lower than today, it was about 150 meters lower, which is about 500, 600 feet lower. Huge amounts of water were trapped in the form of ice in glaciers 3 kilometers high. And 18,000 years ago, when the ice began to melt, the Black Sea, the Propontis, and the North Aegean Sea did not communicate with each other because the current sea lanes of the Bosporus and Dardanelles were then dry. The Hellespont area around Istanbul today of Turkey. So all that was landmass. Now, the great rivers of northeastern Europe and western Asia, which flow into the Black Sea, supplied it with the water of the melting ice to the north. The sea level in the Black Sea, which was then a closed basin of fresh water, rose faster from the corresponding sea of the world. It crossed the Bosphorus and formed the Propontis. Through the Dardanelles, it reached the northeast Aegean. The question is, how did Diodorus know all this? Most likely, the phenomenon of the flood made such an impression on the inhabitants of the wider area that its memory was preserved in the oral tradition of mythology for over 10,000 years. The image shows the situation that prevailed in icy Europe 18,000 years ago. The EE curve delimits the areas that were covered by glaciers. The BB corresponds to the border of tree vegetation, while AA corresponds to the current limit of permanently frozen soils. And in the images with the rising sea level, we see Delos Island united with its neighboring islands, and the word Delos means that which is manifested. In mythology, Delos is the island where Leto gave birth to Apollo. Of course, Delos can also mean the fact that it stood out from the neighboring land due to the rising sea level. In this way, the mythological descriptions are connected with the natural geographical changes that occurred in the recent geological past at the time of the Younger Dryas impact. That's when a lot of extreme extinction level events took place. Even the mammoths and the megafauna, megaflora went extinct, the Clovis culture of North America. And this is exactly the time of the sinking of Atlantis. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. I hope you found it informative. So we do have a lot of evidence in Greek mythology that is corroborated by archaeology and paleogeology as well. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support.